Uh, what can the church do to help?
Addressing it to people just individually is don't be afraid of the farmer that is going through these times. He's a person just like you at any time. It's a sense of loss and grieving that we have to go through. And we just to know that you're there, that you care, that you'll lend an ear to listen, that you don't judge us in any way, that we're a part of the church just like you, and we need all of you. Don't run away from it, because it's not just an issue, it's made up of people who have very real hurts.
I think it's important then that as neighbors and fellow members of congregations, partners in faith, that we seek ways that we can relate to people like Rick and his family. And the most important one is just to continue to remember what they're going through and not to be afraid to go up to them and ask how it's going. Simple things like that. So often we're afraid to broach the issue because we don't know what to say. We don't know how they're feeling. We don't want to offend them. And perhaps that's the biggest disservice. It's not a sign of disrespect to ask about something this sensitive. It's really a sign of respect, because it's really saying, we know you're struggling and you can handle it. Is there a way we can help? And usually, if there's any relationship at all, it doesn't take much more than that. They need to talk about it. It's very much like a death. And at a time of death, one thing people need to do is have a chance to talk about it, sometimes to tell it over and over again. That's part of the healing. And we need to be there for each other to provide that.
I guess the thing that I find most helpful is simply to continue to visit with people, to stop by and to say, how are you doing? Not how is the situation going or anything like that, but how are you doing as an individual? Sometimes that has meant going back as many as 4 and 5 times and being as open and as honest about that question of how are you doing. And sooner or later, I guess I have found that people begin to say how they're feeling.
To realize that we can't give a lot of answers, but that we can be with people, and that's how Christ is Emmanuel in us, that God is in us to others, and that we can be a friend. And just simply being there, not letting go of people, not abandoning them when they need people the most.
That's what the church ought to be about at this moment, is realizing that it is a caring community, and that everyone that's a part of the body of Christ has that gift and that ability to do it. We don't have to have answers for people in these situations. We don't have to tell them that this is what your future is or this is how you blew it in the past. It's just a matter of being able to be there.
I think we also need to affirm that there's something wrong that's going on here, so that our farm people don't feel, well, it's all my fault. I'm the one that failed. That to help them articulate and recognize that there's something wrong with a society that isn't willing to pay for food to such an extent that our farmers can stay on the land and take care of the land.
I'm convinced that farmers, anyone that's in trouble at this point in the rural situation, if they believe that they are understood, can open up and say the way it is.
There's a lot of pressure that our rural families are experiencing, and sometimes it's the farmer that is dealt with who is going through the crisis. But I think the church needs to help us be aware that it's also affecting the spouse in profound ways, sometimes the person who gets overlooked, as well as the children in farm families.
Older farmers who have gone through the 30s, and they remember what that was like. And as my father-in-law is an example, he says that the 30s were tough, but right now to try to buy a tractor for $85,000 or a combine for $120,000 and then still get the same prices that I got when I quit farming, he said it's ridiculous. And that has created within his congregation an openness on the part of people who are hurting to come to Charles and say, hey, you know, I'm glad you understand and you know what's going on.
We're seeing many, many more farm families than we once did. We've always seen farm families through our services, both in our counseling and our group work, and in the congregational work we've done, but we're seeing so many more now. The kinds of problems that we're seeing seem much greater and far more intense than previously. We see much more serious depression and suicide possibilities. We're seeing families that are torn apart, both in terms of marriages and between parents and children.
It's overwhelming at times. It's come on for many of them rather suddenly. It's caught them by surprise, and they're not quite sure what has happened to them. And I think the church is a place, through forums, through gatherings, through people coming together, where they can sort through some of this and begin to find their way again. So support groups become very important. Many of our congregations are developing support groups, and it's interesting to see farmers who have traditionally been very stoic and tended to tough things out by themselves, certainly drawing on their faith, very important to them, but tending to do that quite alone, suddenly finding the power of community in these support groups, discovering that they can share, that there are people who do understand.
Last November, I invited a group of people. It was an open invitation to the community to see if anybody wanted to show up and talk about the farm issue, and 12 people showed up. I expected to be sitting alone in the Watson Cafe that morning all by myself, and 12 people showed up. The first morning we had 23, the second, and we averaged about 18 people throughout the winter months.
A few years back, we would have had a difficult time saying that, gee, we're having a problem or whatever, and most of the time if you heard of somebody having a problem, you kind of shunned away from them.
And I wasn't the only one having the problem, you know, and I was always afraid to admit it, you know, earlier, you know, because I would just talk with Jim about it, you know, and, you know, maybe it's just a time for me to let off a little bit of steam, you know, just get some things off my chest, you know, that, you know, you tend to hold in, you know, you just start feeling depressed and feeling rotten.
I feel that the support of this group has been just terrific. Everybody needs a place to get together and air some of your feelings.
One of the most serious issues that I see here as I deal with families is the isolation that many of them are feeling and having in relation to their neighbors, their church, and their friends. The whole individual aspect of the family farm and people being their own boss and it's their own business leads to an isolation when it comes to troubles and sharing those troubles with other people. Many people have difficulty talking about or letting anyone know the dire financial trouble they're in or the dire emotional problems they may be experiencing as the result of that. I worked with one gentleman almost a year to get him involved in a support group because he saw himself as such a big failure, and he knew that everyone would judge him that way and make judgments on him because he would get involved in a support group. He now goes faithfully and finds that it's just very helpful for him to keep him going from week to week, and sometimes contacts the people from the group in between times.
Some of our congregations are really beginning to see themselves as a catalyst, as a place with their facilities, as a setting where people can come together. And our farm people are finding that they can open up to each other perhaps like they haven't very often at any time in the past, and that they can find strength in each other and strength in their faith together. And I think that's important. On the other hand, we still have a lot of churches, even very much in rural communities, who are either somewhat ignoring the issue or are denying that it exists and are simply not dealing with it. I think also it's important that we as a church recognize the faith dimensions of this and the moral dimensions. There are still too many people who somehow think we can separate this from our faith, and that somehow the church shouldn't be involved because this is only an economic issue. It's much deeper than that. In fact, I think that this is one more symptom of the fact that we as a nation and as a people are at risk of losing our souls. And if there's any point where the church needs to have a voice, and again, that's a moral voice, an ethical voice, it's at a time like this.
The church has been increasingly involved in the ministry to people in pain because of the economic crisis, increasing family violence, deteriorating rural communities. it's having an effect to the number of farmers that leave the land. It's having an effect not just on the structure of agriculture, but on the entire structure of rural communities. School systems, social service agencies, the church itself has a self-interest in this because we're losing members in our rural parishes. So that as a pastoral concern, the crisis, economic crisis in agriculture is a very severe one for the church to be involved in. And that's a classic way that the church is involved, to help people who are in pain. But the other side of that then is advocacy, and to try to develop through our work with Congress some kind of policies that will not just help with the immediate crisis in terms of emergency credit, which is very important, but also would provide some kind of goals, restructuring of agriculture so that we don't keep going from crisis to crisis from year to year, which is the way we've been doing.
People shouldn't think that those letters and those efforts are wasted. The great illustration is the Civil Rights Act of 1963 and 64, when all of a sudden the churches started standing up and people started writing in. And you had one famous senator who was, the beginning of the debate, was opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then by the end of the debate he was arguing for it, and he said, this is a moral issue. Well, some letters had, whether it was the quantity or the quality of the mail that convinced him, I don't know, but he got turned around. And people do get turned around. There are a lot of members who do not feel strongly on one thing or another. But there are issues that I don't feel that strongly about, and where I pay a great deal of attention to mail.
I can't remember a lot of what happened the last week before the sale. I suppose it's a mental block or exhaustion or whatever, but I know that Steve and I hadn't been talking much, and I just, I was just the lowest thing on earth, and we had completely blocked this sale out of our minds. It was just, we got up, we did our chores, we ate breakfast, he went to the field, and it was things like that. We didn't do anything to get ready for that sale, and it was a week. We had like 5 days before the sale, and we hadn't done anything. And David had come over on a Tuesday night to ask us if there was anything that he and Ferry could do to help us to get ready for the sale. Well, the last thing in the world you're ever going to admit to a fellow farmer is that you need help. I mean, that's just not fashionable. You handle your own problems and you don't need help from anybody. Well, that was exactly what Steve said. Oh, no, we'll manage. And David said, well, it's less than a week, and maybe you could use, no, we'll manage just fine. Well, David went home and told Ferry this, and the next morning, I think it finally maybe hit home. I don't know if maybe David's visit had kind of sparked a little bit of life in me into realizing that, gosh, it was 5 days and we didn't have anything done. The next morning after David had been there, I was in the milk house cleaning up after we were done milking, and it was just like someone had come up behind me and hit me in the head with a sledgehammer, because all of a sudden it dawned on me that, gosh, we had so much work to do. It was unbelievable, and we hadn't done any of it, and it was 5 days until the sale, and I knew for a fact that morning I was going to have a breakdown. I just knew it. And Steve came in the milk house, and I was crying, and I said, does a person know when you're going to crack up? Because I know today's the day. And he just kind of stood there. He didn't, probably the most decent word I'd said to him, for 2 weeks, asking him if I was going to crack up. Well, he said, honey, why don't you just go lay down for a while? I said, I don't need to lay down. I need help. And I walked outside. I thought maybe if I got some fresh air, I would feel better. And here I saw the neighbor's pickup pulling up by the machine shed. And I guess that wasn't so unusual. The neighbors were stopping in on and off. But then there were 2 or 3 more pickups, and I thought, this is just about all I need today. I'm half nuts, and now I'm getting company on top of everything else. Well, that company turned out to be about 35 of the neighbors that had come to help us get ready for that sale. The women had brought food, and they set up a little cafe in the garage, and I didn't do a thing all day long except walk around and cry and thank people for coming, And I was just in shock. You know, it's such a dog-eat-dog world, and everybody's looking out for number one, and that's not true. It's not like that. I just couldn't believe that there was that much goodness, and it was all right there in my neighborhood, and I didn't even know it. And it just, oh, it made me feel so good that day. I just went to bed with such a peaceful heart that night for the first time in a long, long time. I've said it a million times, that group of people gets credit for reaffirming our faith in the human race and in God and saving our marriage, because that was the plan up until that morning, that I was going back to live with my mother and Steve was going up to Gary to work, and the heck with all this. You know, you had 12, 13 good years of marriage. Just, it was getting to be just too much work to try and hold that marriage together. And I still say, thanks to that bunch of people, Steve and I are together today. Because I guess we just kind of felt that, gosh, if they think enough of us as a couple, there's got to be something left there that you can rebuild or repatch. You know, there's cracks. You don't put anything back together again without cracks, but we're working on it, and we're all right.
We were, well, it was pretty knowledgeable, well, knowing that we were extremely poor people, but after the work that the Langers did and all our other neighbors, that night we felt like probably the richest people in the community. And it just, we'd never be able to thank them.
How am I ever going to thank all these people? And she looked at me and she said, well, they don't want thanks. She said, we're here because we love you. And that was what I needed to hear right then and there, that somebody did love me and they did care. And they did want to make sure that Steve and I made it through those terrible times, and we were together and we were well and we were happy. And that was just exactly the words that I needed to hear that day. And we had talked about that at the same time too, and Ferry said, now look around you. She said, this is the communion of saints right here. And it went on and on and on, you know, for 5 days. Everybody kept coming back. And I know in my lifetime I will never have an experience that will move me the way that did. To know that there were that many people in that neighborhood that cared about me, and they wanted to make sure that I was all right, and that Steve was all right, and that we were all right. That was important to them. And I guess that kind of turned our attitudes around, and gosh, then it must be important to us too. We'll make it important to us.